on biological diversity. And I'd like to welcome you all to this side event organized here in the context of COP28, entitled Addressing Biodiversity and Climate Change Synergistically, Scaling Up Implementation for Success. As we now know increasingly, biodiversity loss and climate change are indeed interdependent and interconnected global crises. Biodiversity is crucial, providing vital ecosystem services such as clean air, water, pollution, nutrient cycling, and it also enhances ecosystem resilience and adaptation to climate change, contributing to the overall mitigation of its effects. Biodiversity loss can disrupt these services and can lead to cascading ecological consequences, including the collapse of ecosystems and increased vulnerability to climate change impacts, which are unequally felt around the world. The Kunming Global Biodiversity Framework, adopted in December of last year, sets out an ambitious roadmap towards addressing biodiversity loss. Recognizing that biodiversity is fundamental to human well-being, a healthy planet, and economic prosperity for all people, the framework provides targets and the means of implementation to achieve them. Recognizing the interplay between biodiversity loss and climate change, effective co-implementation is fundamental. This entails adopting effective land use practices, promoting sustainable consumption and production, reducing emissions, and conserving and restoring biodiversity-rich areas. These all require increased and sustained financing, often from new and innovative sources. By using synergistic solutions, we can not only help mitigate and adapt to climate change, but also safeguard biodiversity, ultimately ensuring a sustainable and resilient future for both humanity and the planet. Our side event today will take the form of a moderated fireside chat where we've got participants to exchange views and experiences. To enable a fruitful discussion, the fireside chat will be facilitated by me, and we'll look around some focus questions to structure the debates. We may get questions from the audience depending on how fast we go through, and we'll be doing this in English. So we're going to open now and put it all into context, and we are waiting for some of our speakers, but without further ado, I want us to get started with our first speaker, is Hans Otto Portner, who was the co-chair of IPCC's AR6 working group 2 area. So Hans Otto, welcome to the panel. I'm going to start with asking you one key question. So biodiversity is clear, it's our strongest ally in our fight against climate change. So back in 2021, IPBES and IPCC experts joined forces to analyze the interconnections between nature and climate change and search for solutions that would do both, to stabilize our climate and restore and strengthen biodiversity. So you co-led this initiative as the co-chair of the IPCC Working Group 2 in the 6th assessment cycle. What conclusions did you and your colleagues draw from your joint scientific assessment? And what can be done to foster the recovery of damaged and degraded ecosystems? And then the third part of this, you've got a good memory, so you'll be able to keep track of all of these. What kind of governance is needed to accelerate ecosystem recovery worldwide? So with these three questions, I turn the floor over to you.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for the kind introduction and for the opportunity to present our workshop findings here. And these workshop findings actually made it into several of the reports that we produced during the last assessment cycle, especially the Working Group 2 report and to some extent the also the synthesis report. And the key pillar actually for including these thoughts on climate and biodiversity to be solved together is involved or has been presented by this report, IPBES IPCC 2021, that you see in the bottom line. And there were several publications, scientific publications coming out of this and bringing this to the fore, also in the scientific community. And there's a basic understanding that actually we need to look at the planet and what's happening on the planet from the point of view of a system understanding. And there are three key systems that are interacting. There's the climate system, the biodiversity, and human society. And human society, in the course of the industrial evolution, has gained influence to an extent that it is changing the balances between those three systems. And in the this display on the left-hand side, you see the red arrows and how they emphasize essentially the negative interactions that are triggered by the activities of human society. So much of what we are talking about is really is identifying the mistakes made during the industrial era and how we can actually correct for these mistakes, because as a result of these negative interactions triggered by human society with climate change and ecosystems, we have climate change, biodiversity loss, land degradation, pollution, and so forth. So, and one message is very clear: our choices have to be made now for this, and in the near term, and especially the pressure, the time pressure coming is defined by climate change, and considering how hot it gets for humankind, but also considering that, for example, among human generations, those born today will actually see the worst outcome of our current decisions by the end of the century, or they will see the positive outcomes of these decisions. And WWF has made it clear that it's not about us only, but it's also about other species coexisting with us on the planet. Biodiversity being a very important aspect, and not only feeling sympathy with the other creatures that share the planet with us together, but also considering our joint role in maintaining the balances on the planet. And that means emphasizing and shifting our activities to the positive interactions between the key systems. We can mitigate climate change, adapt to climate change. Nature can also adapt to and contribute to mitigation, as we've heard, and we can make an effort to conserve and restore nature, and bringing our own strategy to be healthy, so human health and well-being together with ecosystem health, and finally planetary health, stopping these mega trends through transformation, and that concerns virtually every aspect of human society, also with respect to our relationship with ecosystems and the climate. Now, the picture that we've been developing in this workshop report is talking about a mosaic landscape, so land, sea, and freshwater scapes, actually sustaining gradients between well-protected and used spaces, and developing some guidelines and principles in how we actually should move forward in our interactions with the natural world, effectively protecting biodiversity on 30 to 50% of land, freshwater, and ocean systems, and doing this so that these spaces are interconnected, that there are migration corridors, but the principles are valid for all of these different systems on land, in freshwater, and in the ocean. And there are some aspects to be mentioned, which address also the second question asked. It's about mosaic spatial planning and implementation, with a focus on the conservation and stabilization of carbon-rich habitats, with a strategy to enhance carbon storage in organisms and soils, and for the ocean we have to say sediments. We have to consider adaptation limits very clearly for these natural systems, and that brings me to one important aspect with respect to climate, that actually climate change needs to be limited to make this work. And a strategy needs to be that there is a net gain in biodiversity, in whatever disturbance is being done to the natural systems. There need to be compensatory measures and moving towards bending the curve for biodiversity and bringing it back. It means behavioral changes for humankind, for example, reduced meat and milk consumption, agroforestry, woodland pasture, which actually brings and frees land for the purpose of securing human nutrition, but also freeing space for biodiversity. It's just not sustainable to use 80% of the land resources for the production of animal feed. So the overall picture is that we need to integrate the human interests into this view as well in the context of adaptation, securing livelihoods and securing health for the benefit of the planet. And the key issue to be emphasized is that actually controlling and limiting climate change is a major precondition for making all of this successful. So it's not that nature will sort of rescue us out of the climate dilemma, but we need to stop climate change in order to enable nature to help us in the long term to stabilize our climate system. And that this is already being challenged. You see on this figure in the red dots where the productivity of key ecosystems is already during the heat exposure, during the hot months of the year, that capacity is already being constrained. And if you go across latitudes, sorry for the German word there, Breitengrad, if you go across latitudes on this side and you see how the productivity curve is pushed from the blue to the orange already under present conditions, you see how urgent it is to stop climate change in order to enable biodiversity and the key ecosystems to help us stabilize the climate. So the science is clear. Any further delay in concerted global action will miss a brief and rapidly closing window to secure a livable future for all, and that also includes us as a species, but it also includes many other species. Our reports offer solutions to the world, but it is very clear also that it is getting late and it's urgent to take action. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you very much, Hans Otto. Very clear that, as you said in your closing slide, our choices have to be made now. It has an impact on humans and an impact on other species. Your guiding principles quite fascinating. The notion of a mosaic landscape, and I've seen that diagram in our work under the convention. The idea that carbon-rich habitats need to be a really focus of things. The idea that there are indeed adaptation limits for these systems, very, very clear too. And that we need to have these interventions that make for a net gain for biodiversity. Behavioral change is always very, very difficult. You know, how do you make these changes in food consumption of people as well? And that there is this need to consult the human interests. And then this important precondition is that it's not just about nature is going to save us, it's that we need to take the steps in terms of reducing climate change so that nature itself can be in a position to save us. Thank you very, very much. Okay, I'm going to practice a bit of adaptive management, which we talk about under the convention, because we don't have all of our speakers. So I'm going to turn now to Adel Ramdani, who is part of the Swiss Youth for Climate movement. So Adel, the questions that I've got for you are the following. So Adel, considering that the Paris Agreement and the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework demonstrate ambition by governments to tackle the climate crisis, so it means there's a willingness, we have seen that that ambition doesn't always equate to the type of action needed. So the Global Biodiversity Framework asks for a whole of society as well as a whole of government response. And there is a specific mention of intergenerational equity as one of the cost-cutting principles. And so, on the basis of that, how do you see that ambition becoming action in order to effectively address the challenges and put us on the right path? Adel, over to you.
Yeah, thanks for that question. I think you're absolutely right. I think we are in a situation where we have policies in place, but we don't take into account the element of power. And we do have to address power in the climate space, because what I see in the field way too often is that we look at climate change only from a climate perspective. So we talk a lot about reducing carbon emissions. We talk a lot about the need for new technologies. We talk about the need to go very fast and beyond. But I am reminded of a very dear friend of mine who said to me once, the times are so urgent that we need to slow down, right? Mm. And that really means that we are used, especially my generation, to a society which is, fueled with those fossil fuels that allows us to travel everywhere, to have even passions and culture based on the idea that everything can be received so quickly through like a single order online that you get the next day if you get the premium package. And what we have to do through those policies is really to reconcile the need to slow down, the need to be more localized, and the need to get communities buy-in in the solutions that we develop together. So I think there are three things that I want to point out based on your question. The first one is, of course, the fact that we live in a polycrisis, and this is unprecedented in history. So we have all those crises coming at us at the same time, but the way we have built our institutions is that they are highly siloed, right? So when you look at the UN or other organizations, one is dealing with women issues, one is dealing with children, one is dealing with refugees or migrants, as if you can't be a woman who is a refugee, who has children, all at the same time. But the funding and the decision-making processes that come with those agencies don't take into account those realities. So what we need to do is to move from a reductionist approach to a systems-based approach. And let's be clear on that. We are not able to do that yet. So what we need to do is to really look at how do we create systems and institutions that understand that reality when it comes to the funding, when it comes to the voices included, so that we truly look at what are the key sectors that can create momentum and have the greatest potential for change at the same time. The second element which comes with that is really about funding. As you mentioned, to have behavioral change, you need community buy-in. So we need to come to a situation in which youth-led organizations, indigenous communities, women-led organizations do receive the funding to get the work started in the field. Now the challenge to that is that when you have government money or funding and those grants which are massive, those NGOs are not able to get that funding because they are too small. So what you have to do is to look at intermediaries, re-grantors, and entities based in the global south able to get that funding and then to get the funding to the right place. And as long as we keep choosing funding vehicles based in key European or Western capitals, we are not going to be able to reach those communities and therefore get the community buy-in that we need for that transition to happen. And that leads me to my third and most important point, which is about social justice and power dynamics in the field. As long as we are not able to reach those communities, we won't be able to change the dynamics when it comes to what has to be done in those countries that are living the climate reality in the most painful way. And that means that we have to kind of restore our relationship with nature in a way which is even moving from a system of extraction to a system of healing. And you are not able to do that as long as you don't reach those communities. And that's kind of my concern, and that's a big concern I see in the field, which is that you come up with those technologies and those solutions which are not developed where the realities are happening. And therefore, you just look at climate change from a carbon perspective and from a reducing emissions perspective. But at the end of the day, if a tractor is destroying the soils, whether it's running on green energy or fossil fuels, it's still destroying the soils, right? So what we have to look at is what kind of society do we want, what kind of growth do we want, and what kind of economic system do we want to promote, which goes beyond the current extractive economic system. So I guess my main point today is really to say we have to center people-centered solutions much more. We have to look at, and that's one of the key things I do whenever I go and speak on a panel, is look at what are the voices missing here, who is not here. And as long as we don't look at that specifically and including those communities, we won't be able to make it. You're talking about a specific framework today, and we know those terms because this is part of what we do, this is our job. But when I talk to communities in the field, they don't think about the SDGs, they don't think about data-driven solutions. They talk about the rivers being our bloodline, they talk about forests being our ancestors. They look at the land and the need to take care of the land for not the next 3 financial quarters, but the next 3 generations. But current systems don't look at the next 3 generations. We're looking at what has to be done right here and right now. I saw coming here that, apparently we have entered the decade of actionism. So I wonder what we did before that, we're not doing action at all. So I think we have to be extremely aware of the fact that this space that we sit in is not neutral, funding is not neutral, and climate negotiations are absolutely not neutral. And this is for me where power lies. So that's what we do, at Swiss Youth for Climate. This is what we do with our people. We are asking them, how can you reclaim your own narrative, your own space, and your own terminology? And I know I speak a lot with like those big concepts, but a key element that we have to look at, and this is where I always ask you the question: where does the money go? Where is the money held? And what is the mechanism that holds that money? I do believe that one of the solutions is absolutely to create funds based in the Global South that knows the communities. And I'll give you two examples of that. One is the Youth Climate Justice Fund. And the Youth Climate Justice Fund is a youth-led, youth-owned fund which decides exactly where the money goes based on people who know the realities on the ground. The funding comes from different sources, but the board of directors are young people from different places who know their realities, and are able to pick the right solution to the right context. And the other one is the Climate Justice Resilience Fund, which is also a funders collaborative, coming with fresh money, but you move the power because those are the ones who decide where the money goes. And let's be very transparent when we talk about money, because in the system we live in, the money is extractive, and the system we live in is an extractive system. So when you're aware of that reality, then it changes the whole conversation. And I was on a panel recently about, how do you create the green revolution? And then they talked about deep sea mining. And I was like, wait a second. So in order to restore a relationship with the land, we are going to now extract critical minerals from the deep sea bed in order to fuel the green revolution. That doesn't seem right to me. So that's why I really talk about shifting from an extractive system to a healing system. And you don't heal as long as you don't go back to folks who have been oppressed for centuries and centered their solutions. There is no such thing as a nature-based solutions. There is no such thing as data-driven solutions. What you have is indigenous communities who work with the land, right? We have just discovered here in Europe, here in Europe, where I come from, that you can use nature for, the common good. But many communities have figured that out a couple of centuries ago, so we're just a bit late. So this is what I wanted to say today, and kind of really rebalance the conversation around communities as opposed as only looking at our own frameworks and our own programming. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Good. Thank you very, very, very much, Adele. So I did really love one of your first phrases. The times are so urgent, we need to slow down. And I think that gives us a sense that it's consistent with everything else you were saying, is that what is the perspective we're looking at in this way? And so you pointed out we're living in a polycrisis. And so our approach to engaging with all the different stakeholders and actors and people also has to be on that basis. We need to look at the multiple identities involved and what are the key sectors. And your other big question, who gets the funding? Very, very important. Which groups is it going to? And then it's not just about this question of absorptive capacities, which we frequently talk about, but it's about where are these funding vehicles located? Really, really important indeed, and looking at that. The typical pattern we've got has got to change as well. And then your extensive comments on that this is a social justice question as well, as any of this adaptation or justice is all about this as well. So, and it's a people-centered solution we're looking for. Thank you very, very much, Adele. Now, let's see, we are going to do a bit of adaptive management. I see we've got other people on the panel here. So, so actually, Adele and Hans Otto, I am going to actually ask you to find a seat in the audience, because we need to bring up Olga Pilafosova. Sorry, Olga. Olga, you're here? Good. Olga? So yeah, no, please come up, because it will. So Olga, you can come up, and we've also got the Vice Minister here as well. And then I guess Bapon, is Bapon still here? Okay, come on, Bapon, we'll try to. These other speakers will still be in the audience, and we'll still try to manage questions with them later on, but we have a very extensive panel. So we're going to move now to the topic of less than a decade for action. And to that regard, I'm going to invite David Cooper, my boss, the Acting Executive Secretary of the Convention on Biological Diversity. So David, we've just heard of the challenges we're facing, and we need to work more closely with all members of society, IPLCs and the next generations, to ensure that action happens to meet the ambition. So can we get to hear your thoughts on a couple of things? First of all, how do we bring that ambition to action? Not least given the discussions here around the need to equally address climate change in an urgent, effective manner. But also, I think I want you to zoom in on how do we integrate actions under the Convention on Biological Diversity and under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. David, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, David. Good day to everyone. It's good to see a full house for this event. I think Hans Otto and Adele have set the scene very well, and I will build a lot on what they have said. It's clear that the loss of biodiversity, climate change, degradation of land, degradation of ecosystems more generally, these are really interrelated issues. And in fact, at the first part of COP15, which took place in Kunming in October 2021, these were seen as parts of a whole interrelated crisis that posed existential threats for humanity, for our economies. And they really have to be addressed together. And I think I would really like to appreciate the work that Hans Otto has led in the IPCC over many years, and then also in bringing together IPBES, the IPCC for biodiversity, if you like, to join forces with the IPCC to further develop the science on this. And in fact, we saw, I think, in the 6th assessment report of AR6, this issue and this interrelation addressed extremely well. And it shows that, yes, we, of course, have to keep the emphasis on reducing emissions from fossil fuels above all. But in addition to that, not as a replacement to that, but in addition to that, we must invest in ecosystem-based approaches or nature-based solutions, as they're known, as an essential part of efforts to stay within 1.5 degrees. But this isn't only about the carbon. It isn't only about sequestering carbon. It's also about ensuring that that carbon in those ecosystems are resilient. And that means we have to maintain the biodiversity. We have to maintain the functioning of those ecosystems. This is recognized in the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, adopted in Montreal just short of a year ago. We have a specific target, Target 8, which looks at this issue. In that target, though, we also focus, of course, that you have to address climate change. If we do not address climate change, it's simply impossible to bend the curve of biodiversity loss. We cannot halt and reverse biodiversity loss if we don't also keep within 1.5 degrees. And I think, as we've heard now very well from Adele, this has to be through a whole of society approach as well as a whole of government approach. It has to engage everyone. The challenge, as he set out there, is that we have to do this quickly. We have to address both aspects of this interrelated challenge of biodiversity loss and climate change this decade. In the remaining years of this decade, we have 6 or 7 years really to make the differences that are needed. But we have to do this in a way that is really participatory, that engages the whole of society, in indigenous peoples and local communities, women and youth. It must respect the rights of indigenous peoples and local communities. And in fact, this is very much embedded in the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework as a cross-cutting issue. I'm sure my colleague Olga will talk more also about the linkages with the Climate Convention, but we are very much hoping to see increased linkages between the two processes. Tomorrow, at the initiative of the Chinese presidency, together with the UAE presidency, we will have a major declaration looking at how to integrate work on climate change, including through the nationally determined contributions, with work on biodiversity through the national biodiversity strategies and action plans. Every country now is busy in translating the global framework agreed in Kunming into national targets and national actions through the national biodiversity strategies and action plans. It's clear that in light of the stocktake going on here this week, that nationally determined contributions will need to be enhanced, and there's a key opportunity here to integrate the two agendas as these processes go on at the national level. So we really hope to see much more recognition in both communities of the need to work with the other at the global level and also at the national level. So let me, in the interest of time, let me leave it at that. Happy to come back later if there are questions. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, David. Yeah, you've already pointed out some of the real ways that we can be bringing these processes together, and indeed that question of NDCs and NBSAPs and some of the specifics of that will be extremely important. We can cover that in the discussion later on. I do want to recognize the arrival right now of the Vice Minister, Zhao Yingmin, the Vice Minister of the Ministry of Ecology and Environment of the People's Republic of China, representing the COP15 presidency. Vice Minister, welcome to this panel. We're going to turn now for comments from Olga Pilifosova, who's a manager in the Adaptation Division of the UNFCCC Secretariat. So, Olga, for you, we want to ask the following. So, with IPCC's AR6, the global stocktake, and a number of other studies emphasizing the need to take urgent action, we know that this link to conservation and restoration will help us mitigate and adapt to climate change very, very well, and it can't be understated. So the question to you is, how do you see these links being taken forward here at COP28 and beyond? So importantly, where do we need to go from here?
Thank you very much for the questions.
We need a microphone to Olga, please.
How do you do that?
Just close.
No, closer. Okay, sorry. Thank you. So clearly, as we say here, the biodiversity and climate change is linked, and of course this nature is the part of the solution for climate change, but also very often becomes a victim. And this scope, coming to what are the synergies between these processes, and we'll be talking about from the point of view of processes. This COP is supposed to mark the culmination of the first global stocktake, a mechanism which was created under the Paris Agreement, which would be evaluating our advancement and progress towards the Paris Agreement goals. But as we know, that there are two goals are set clearly. Is mitigation goal is no more than 1.5 and 1.2 and 2 degrees, but finance goal is also defined by parties, but we don't have any goal of similar nature of the adaptation. And we hope that since this COP also marks the culmination of the work program on global goal on adaptation, has also defined this target, with this goal, which is framed of the sustainable development and temperature target. So this marks this distinctive opportunity for us, for multilateral processes, to unite the efforts to contributing to the realization of this forward-looking objectives outlined in the UNFCCC and Paris Agreement. At the same time, the global call on adaptation and how does it help? How does it help adaptation at the national and local level, and what does it do in terms of bringing also the other multilateral and global efforts in the picture. And just as a backdrop, the two figures that the IPCC probably knows very well, that the science tells us that we have to reduce emissions by 43% by 2030. In reality, promises, not actions, but promises, are leading to increase of 8.8% by 2030. So this signifies the urgency of working not only on adaptation, but also the synergetically with the biodiversity and other conventions of Rio. Second, what does it mean to adapt globally? And in terms of the level, we know that at different levels, climate change adaptation means different things. And moreover, what is considered to be a successful adaptation at the national level or the local level might be maladaptive on even harming in the global concept. Let me give you an example which is very relevant to the audience that we have here. For example, the country has a forest and has as a result of climate change become the threat to the food security. So it decides, it has two opportunities, either to import more or to cut the forest. And the more economically viable they find to cut the forest, and they have the crops, and they consider themselves adapted to the future in terms of food security. But in aggregate level for the world, it becomes reduction in resilience, and even harming the mitigation efforts because the uptake has decreased. So we see that all the time in the transboundary impacts and the national adaptation plans, as parties are reporting to the UNFCCC, they see that especially that enhancement of resilience in one country, especially when it concerns the forest I mentioned, but also shared river bases, can lead to reduction in resilience in another country. So this is a big problem that we are facing as we need to scale up adaptation. As we said, that for the first, looking at the first figures, mitigation is not enough. And this is not yet solved, but the process has established this process to, the UNFCCC process in Paris Agreement established this process to identify the common global priorities, so that we can together align at different levels the actions to those priorities and help those who are having difficulties with that. So that what is trying to articulate the global goal on adaptation, the framework that parties are now discussing, not so far, not very successfully, because yes, there are a lot of different interests involved here, is to what would be the landing zone for the whole world that the global goal on adaptation framework or just the global goal on adaptation is setting. So we do use the SDGs as a starting point, but still doing that is very fine, again, different aspiration, and for different people it means different things. So we're looking at the process of creating a massive and very innovative, very complex methodology, basically, and that allows us a bottom-up assessment of adaptation and trying to interface this level together in the way that makes sense and that advance the global goals. So, of course, we need, in coming years, what you were asking, what is this that we are at and how we can help each other. We look at the experience, wisdom, and already applications of existing goals that set at the multilateral agreements. And during these 2 years, parties and experts, by discussing what can be representing the global goal, they have considered not only the goals that were put in on the CBD, Sendai, and other processes, but also how they're being implemented, what are the underlying methodological, what are the data requirements, and so on. the acknowledging the close relationship between the topics addressed by this various framework. Parties and experts also target of maintaining enhance. They looked closely on on the target set under the CBD that on your framework that protecting 30% of land and oceans by 2030. And it was put forward as a part of the framework at this time, and we will see how this will be developing. So basically, I think I will stop here. That maybe one word about the indigenous knowledge and people. It's also very much taking up under the UNFCCC process and the process of the global goal on adaptation as well. They are only 6% of people, but they are sort of in charge of 80% of biodiversity, and this cannot be avoided when their wisdom and their practices cannot be avoided when developing such a goal. So I will stop here, and thank you very much.
Great. Thank you very much, Olga. Thank you. The sort of challenges you talked about is that what does it mean to adapt globally, and this notion that national adaptation may be maladaptive at the global level too, and that this is a complexity. When we think about the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, indeed the idea of trying to reconcile global goals with specific national realities is also the challenge. So it's good to see that there's a way forward that we'll be looking at moving on that. And then also very much appreciate your comments on the importance of IPLCs. Certainly under the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, some of the most effective conservation measures are those that are held by IPLCs and their traditional knowledge. So we're now going to move to the important role of governments, and it's a great pleasure for us to have with us the Vice Minister, Zhao Yingming, representing the COP15 presidency. So Vice Minister, the floor is yours to talk about the important role of China. So China's got this leadership role in getting us all here to bend the curve in biodiversity loss, and so the audience and all of us here would like to hear more about the actions that you're taking at home in China and also abroad, and where you see the opportunities going forward to help us achieve the goals of the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework by 2030. Vice Minister.
谢谢主持人，各位朋友，非常荣幸出席这次辩会，和大家探讨应对气候变化和保护生物多样性这两个非常重要的议题。
Thank you, and dear friends, I am very happy to be here at this side event to discuss with you all the important topics of biodiversity and climate change.
事实上，我们人类正面临着气候变化和生物多样性快速丧失，带来的严峻挑战。二者互为因果，密切相关，所以需要我们共同应对。
Now, at present, we are facing severe challenges of global climate change and rapid loss of biodiversity. These two are closely related and need joint effort.
事实上，就像刚才这个库珀先生提到的，保护和恢复生物多样性本身就可以增强地球气候韧性这个助力我们气候目标的实现和实现 联合国2030年可持续发展目标。
Just as Mr. Cooper said, protection and restoration of biodiversity is helpful to enhancing the climate resilience of the Earth, to realize our climate goals and help us to achieve the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals.
去年12月呢，在 COP15 第2阶段，我们在加拿大蒙特利尔这个中国作为主席国。 携手各方，历史性的达成了昆明蒙特利尔全球生物多样性框架。
Last December, during COP15 Part 2 in Montreal, Canada, China, as the COP15 presidency, joined hands with all parties to reach the historical Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework.
昆明框架呢，历史性的描绘了2050年人与自然和谐共生的美好愿景。 应该说是我们协同应对气候变化和遏制生物多样性丧失提供了行动方案。
And the historical Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity framework described a beautiful vision of living in harmony with nature by 2050 and provided an action plan for us to work together on climate change and reverting biodiversity loss.
的确，就像主持人说的，政府在应对气候变化和保护生物多样性方面，应该说发挥着非常重要的作用。
Exactly as mentioned, the government can play an important role in the coordinated efforts of addressing biodiversity loss and climate change.
中国是生物多样性的大国，也是受气候变化影响最为严重的国家之一。中国政府高度重视生态环境保护的协同治理我们统筹推进降碳、减污、扩绿、增长，为此呢采取了 一系列的措施，应该说也取得了一些进展。
China is one of the most biodiverse countries and one of the countries that are mostly affected by climate change. The Chinese government attaches a great importance to a coordinated approach to ecological environmental protection and working on carbon reduction, pollution control, green coverage expansion, and economic growth. And it has adopted a series of measures in the past years and have achieved some good results.
我们呢以制度建设为根本推动生物多样性主流化，坚持用最严格的制度和最严密的法治保护环境和保护生物多样性，应对气候变化。目前呢，中国生物多样性保护已经上升为国家战略，成为全社会的共识和行动。
We have built a system that is fundamental to mainstreaming biodiversity. We protect the ecological environment, biodiversity, and address climate change with the most strict legal system and the most rigorous rule of law. And by doing that, biodiversity protection has become a national strategy, and it has also become a consensus and actions of the whole society.
保护生物多样性和应对气候变化一样，需要我们以系统治理的方法整体谋划。为此，中国将陆域国土面积30%以上划入了生态保护红线，并加以严格管理，有效保护了90%的陆地生态系统和74%的国家重点保护野生动植物种群。
Biodiversity, like addressing climate change, also need a systematic approach, and that is why we take more than 30% of the land territory under the ecological conservation red lines, and they are under strict management. And by using this measure, we effectively protect 90% of the land ecosystems. And 74% of wild animals and plants under national priority protection.
事实上，中国的这个自然生态保护和生物多样性保护呢，不仅是落实昆明框架协议保护生物多样性，同时也为减缓和适应气候影响做出了贡献。
Actually, China's measure of ecological and biodiversity protection has not only contributed to the implementation of Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework and biodiversity protection themselves, but also have contributed to the mitigation and adaptation to climate change.
中国积极参与全球环境治理。我们2020年宣布了中国的新的 NDC， 同时呢，积极的推动绿色“一带一路”。 广泛的开展气候变化南南合作，落实联合国可持续发展目标，取得积极的进展。应该说，从COP15的第1阶段昆明宣言到第2阶段的昆明框架，不断推动并开启了全球生物多样性保护的新的征程。
We have been actively participating in global environmental governance, having announced the carbon peaking, updated our NDC in 2020, and have conducted many works under the Green Belt and Road and also South-South cooperation on climate change. So that, and also we have made efforts in implementing the UN SDG goals and made some progress. I can say that from the Kunming Declaration in COP15 Part 1 to the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework in COP COP15 Part 2, we have set off on a new journey of global biodiversity governance.
当前呢，正好是昆明框架达成1周年之际，作为 COP15主席国，我想呢，也借此呼吁各缔约方和利益相关方共同努力，携手推进昆明框架的落地，有效地落实 COP15大会的决定。
The Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework is about to celebrate its first anniversary, and China, as COP15 presidency, would like to take this opportunity to call on all parties and stakeholders to work together to promote actions under the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework so as to effectively implement the COP15 decision.
我们呼吁各缔约方对标昆明框架，加快推动 全社会、全政府生物多样性主流化进程，平衡推进生物多样性保护、恢复、可持续利用和会议分享，持续提升生态系统的多样性、稳定性和可持续性。
We call on all parties to, under the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, accelerate mainstreaming biodiversity in the whole government and society, and pursue a balanced progress in conservation, recovery, sustainable utilization, and benefit sharing of biodiversity, and continue to improve the diversity, stability, and sustainability of ecosystems.
我们鼓励各缔约方根据各自的国情，协调推进生物多样性保护和应对气候变化，将保护和可持续利用生物多样性 减缓和适应气候变化置于政策制定和实施的优先位置，加速经济社会的绿色低碳转型。
We encourage all parties to coordinate the efforts to address biodiversity and climate change in accordance with their respective national circumstances, giving priority to conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity, mitigation and adaptation to climate change in their policy formulation and implementation, so as to accelerate green transition in economy and society.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vice Minister. It's evident that this integrated approach that you're pursuing helps us to achieve some of the synergies we're looking at. It's very important to hear that you're looking at mainstreaming as a way to bring these effects across all the areas so that implementation of the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework in China will have this effect also on climate change goals. So thank you very, very much. The Vice Minister has to leave us, so we can thank you very, very much for joining us. A round of applause for the Vice Minister. Thank you. I'm going to invite some members of our next panel to join us, right? So I'd invite Chizuru Aoki and Kai Remco Fisher also to come up on the stage and join us for our next panel on funding the implementation. Come on up. Now, what we'll do for starting for the funding, I'm going to start with our panelist who's been patiently sitting beside me here, waiting for his chance to speak. Bapon Fakhrudin is he's the Water Resources Management Senior Specialist at the Green Climate Fund. And so the question to you, Bapon, is, so within the climate world, I have this understanding that financial resources are equally seen as being insufficient considering the levels required. This is what we see in biodiversity all the time. So in the context of the Green Climate Fund, how do you see the way forward to maximize the support available in line with the action that we need?
Thank you so much, moderator. Thanks everyone for joining this session. As we hear from this particular other panel member, that this twin crisis, which is biodiversity and climate change, is not actually just twin. I would say it's actually multiple crises because we are all actually chasing at least 5 framework up to 2030. And if one actually gets short, other fall short as well. So how actually we make it an even between this interlinkage between this all framework is quite important. And there are quite complex integrated as well as interlinked between those all frameworks and how we're going to address those kind of things. So as one of the largest climate adaptation financing as a GCF, we actually quite strongly stand to support the nature-based solution. And this, if you look at our GCF1 portfolio, 50% of its finance actually went to the market to supporting the nature-based solution, as well as helping to the community as well, other things. And coming from New Zealand, Matauranga Maori or indigenous knowledge is we actually put as upfront, and which believes that everything is integrated. Your ocean, your atmosphere, your land, all are interconnected. So if you're not looking at interconnectedness, it's not going to be sustained. And one of the important aspect on that things is partnership, because we are talking about multi-sectoral, multi-engagement, so, and it requires a strong partnership. Partnership, not only the financer, and this is a good sign, actually, the COP28, you saw that 4 climate financing actually joined hands together to coherence and collaborate whatever the resource we have, to making a greater impact. So the SAFE, Adaptation Finance, GEF, and GCF, we create a joint pavilion. We make actually how we can actually collaboratively work together to create a greater impact into these particular activities. And at the same time, the partnership also require actually the public and private community as well as other stakeholders. And public finance is not enough, obviously, because the amount of demand we have, we cannot actually solve with all this public financing or even with the climate finance that we have. So we need to be ensured that actually how the other finance actually could be bring together, which is basically the private sector engagement into the public sector. But one of the biggest challenges is actually how we bring an element that could enable them to private sector to invest their money, because nobody wants to invest their money unless there is a risk is still there. So what are the de-risking elements we have? And if you look at in the globally, all the financer, there is actually very few institutions who have actually those kind of de-risking instrument. And we would say that GCF is one of the catalytic financer who has all sort of instrument that you like to utilize, not only just grant and highly concessional loan, it also has equity, guarantor, as well as fast loss, all sort of instrument that could enable to the institution to play their role safely to making that de-risking. And GCF also has a quite highly risk appetite, so which actually enables to local entrepreneur as well as private sector to help in a better way. So with these things, I maybe like to just like to say that actually collaboration is quite important, and how we can actually work together is quite important, and all this other framework need to be integrated together. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you, thank you. Thank you very much, Bapon. Yes, the element, how do we do de-risking? And it's actually interesting to hear you right at the end talk about these variety of mechanisms and tools that we can consider. And so when you look at it under the framework, it'll be good to look at that. Are you able to stay with us, or do you have to run away? Okay, so let's bid farewell to Bapon. He's got another event. Like all of us, he's running multiple things at the same time. Thanks. Okay, that musical chairs, there's always someone new sitting beside me every few minutes. Okay, let's now move to the financial mechanism for the Convention on Biological Diversity. And for that, we're very lucky to have Chizuru Aoki, who's the lead environmental specialist of the Global Environment Facility. But please call her Chiz, don't call her Chizuru. So Chiz, we've actually in a time where the GEF has been incredibly successful in its work for biodiversity. You know, we've got one of the most successful replenishment cycles overall, including lots of money for biodiversity. We have now the Global Biodiversity Framework Fund launched, and indeed with enough money to make it operational. So on one hand, we should be cheering, but we know that despite these successes, there's still a mismatch in terms of what governments are aiming to do and the level of resources that we have available. So, how do you see efficiencies being maximized in order to effectively address the challenges and put us on the right path towards achieving those objectives?
Thank you so much, David, and good afternoon, colleagues, and thanks so much for inviting the GEF to be here. So that's a very complicated question that's being put in front of me, but let me just first and foremost say that the intention of the financial mechanism, and we serve at this juncture 6 conventions, including both the Climate Change Convention, the Biodiversity, the Chemicals Conventions, and we also have the newest Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdiction Convention, is that we provide what will you be considering as the financial sort of catalyst and financial integration, and really work with the governments, partners, and the other financiers to catalyze the additional resources. The intention here is that we will be providing the basis for countries to be able to have the capacity to understand what the your basic issues and priorities might be for each of the conventions. And then we also provide resources to enable the countries to be able to leverage, maximize impact, and really bring in additional resources. So I would say it's basically the foundational elements as well as using the money more effectively to be able to leverage more. At this juncture, the JAF, we have the most successful replenishment. It's a $5.33 billion. We were given a request from the parties in CBD to create a new fund, GBFF. It doesn't have a financial target, but we know what Article 1920 would say about this particular issue, right? And then we're also looking at a significant need to realign some of the resources that are being expensed by governments on negative subsidies as well as a lot of other issues. So if what we can do as a GEF to work with the governments is somewhat modest in face of the challenges, how can we do this more effectively? One of the elements, and this is going to sound really fundamental, is that we are still trying to convince countries to look into integrated solutions that would cut across climate and nature, and also climate, nature, and waste and pollution. And some countries really get it. Other countries are still in the mindset of we want to do this for climate, we want to do this for biodiversity, we want to do this for mercury, you know, so on and so forth. So we really need to be sending the message loud and clear to countries that there are integrated solutions, systemic interventions that would cut across all the real conventions as well as your chemicals and waste type priorities. And there should be support made available from the GEF to incentivize that kind of integrated solutions. So that's point number one. Point number one I want to make is that how do you aim for domestic resource mobilization? A lot of countries are looking into really realigning your domestic budget, releasing resources to enable you to address your challenges in a more systematic way. But do you have the basic understanding as well as data to enable you to look into what are the subsidies that are out there? What are some of the positive subsidies that really needs to be encouraged more? And can you actually get the resources to enable you to look into this? And traditionally, I would say in the GEF, we really looked into the costing elements, but we really did not have the tools and resources to enable to really look into that particular matter. And I'm really excited under the new fund, the GBFF, we would be able to support that kind of activities if the countries are interested in going that particular direction. So with that, as well as really being able to work effectively with partners that could catalyze and leverage additional resources. In this case, as my colleague from GCF was talking about, how do you work effectively with the private sector, but how do you really effectively work with multilateral development banks, like regional banks, even national development banks, to really catalyze resources, utilizing some of the de-risking elements of those capacity building, technical assistance elements you can access already from the GEF. So those are some of the elements that I wanted to highlight to try to really address this finance gap that everyone's aware of. Thanks.
Great, thank you very much. Thanks. Yeah, thank you very much, Chiz. So it's very clear that it's interesting to hear you say that you're still working to convince countries to deal with integrated solutions, because that seems to be the discussion I've been hearing for years, and increasingly here at our COP and at this one as well, is how do we get integrated solutions across these issue areas as well. Domestic resource mobilization, certainly under our framework, it's important for that national domestic resource mobilization, and it's encouraging to hear that there's a lot of new ways to support this under the GBFF, because we need those new approaches to make sure that it's not just the international system bringing things, but it's happening at the domestic level. And I'm very glad that you raised the question of it's not just about private financing, we'll talk about in a minute, but it's also about the MDBs and these other instruments. There's a whole landscape of institutions and organizations and banks that can be providing support for this. So thank you very, very much for that. So the third speaker on our question of funding is Kai Remco Fischer, who's a climate lead at UNEP's Finance Initiative. Yes, and actually, so it's Remco, just like I said it was Chiz, it's Remco, it's not Kai, so it's Remco. So Remco, we've been hearing about the role so far, so we've heard about the financial mechanisms for the CBD and the UNFCCC and some others that are the public sources. You know, our colleague from the GEF started to talk about the private sources. Now, how are you, under the UNEP Finance Initiative, working with the private sector, and especially the financial sector, to help leverage this important support? This is very new for us under the convention.
Thanks very much, David, and thank you for having us. I will explain a little bit how we operate and how we're contributing from a finance sector perspective, or mobilizing the finance sector through UNEP be a part on these agendas. I also wanted to reflect a little bit more on why private finance and what is important as we try to mobilize private finance. You know, what are the different nooks and crannies that we need to be addressing as we do that. For those who don't know us, Susan, you do, but not many people in the room. UNEP, we're a network of 500 financial institutions, largely commercial, private sector, commercial banks, commercial insurance companies, pension funds, etc. 50-50 is a split between developing countries. At the moment, it's a pretty globally representative membership, and we work with them to make the finance sector more sustainable. Monumental task, right? Or as we put it, we want to make the activities, operations, decision-making of financial institutions aligned and consistent with the various kind of societal objectives that we have, whether it's the NDGs, Paris, CBD, etc. I lead on climate, so what I'm going to say is more on the climate side, but I do think that the parallels between climate and biodiversity are quite stark when it comes to the economic barriers inhibiting the rechanneling of financial flows that we need. So what I'm going to say, I think it extends as well to not only to climate, but to both climate, biodiversity, and the links between. One of the ways in which we've mobilized the finance sector so far is through science-based targets. Many maybe in the room may be familiar with that. To date, really more on emissions. So we're asking members to set for their portfolios decarbonization targets that align with 1.5 scenarios. And of course, that's very doable on the carbon side of things, where you do have the science and you do have the scenarios. On the biodiversity side, I think we're working on it, and there's good progress. Just last week, we published guidance for commercial banks worldwide on how they can set nature-related, science-based targets for their lending portfolios, for their investment portfolios, etc. But it's a lot more complicated for obvious reasons on the nature and biodiversity front than it is on the biodiversity. It's more complicated on the nature biodiversity front than it is on the climate change mitigation and emissions front. Just I wanted to reflect on three quick headlines. One is public versus private finance and how do we approach that and their respective roles and what's important there. I also wanted to reflect that when we talk about private finance, we need to be always mindful that there's a supply of private finance, and the financial sector that we work with provides that supply. And we work with that sector, of course, because it is the biggest system of financial intermediation that exists in the planet. It's the system that turns savings into investments, while, of course, public finance mostly is tax. Not exclusively, but it's mostly using tax money. Private is savers' money. Biggest financial intermediation system for that is the finance sector. That is why we work for it. But that's the supply side, and we need to also be looking at the demand for private finance, and also in countries of the global south. How do we get supply and demand to match? And the third thing that I'm going to cover quickly is also that when we look at solutions to all of our problems, and when we try to look at them through the perspective of the private sector, of commercial opportunity, we need to make a distinction between developing the solutions, the innovation side of things, and then the adoption of the solution, so the deployment of the mainstreaming of the solution, using the solutions to replace whatever is being used at the moment, which is not being particularly helpful. So number one, the reason private finance is so central is because all of these transitions, whether it's the ecological transition, the net zero transition, the whatever transition, is trillions, not billions, and it's taken us a decade now to get to 100 billion on the climate side. Hopefully we do a lot better in the coming decade, but we need trillions. I think for just on energy alone, it's 1 trillion. UNEP's adaptation gap report for adaptation in developing countries is 300 billion, and the list goes on. But I don't think volume and scale and speed are the only reason for why we need to be thinking systemically about finance, including private finance. I think it's also just that we need to shift economies. And economies, most of the economies today are market-based. We need to change the fabric of the economies. We just change how consumption is done, how production is done, how investment is done. And those are things done, you know, in most economies around the planet, you know, through the finance sector, through the private sector. Clearly, there are very distinct roles between public and private finance, and there are many things that private finance should not get near of. That really can only be funded through public finance, and it's really important that that nuance we get right. Two final points: demand and supply. We very often focus on the supply side of finance. I think if the supply is there, great, problem solved. No, all of the financial institutions in the world will tell you, I would like to invest in things. I would like to invest in nature-based solutions. I would like to invest. But the projects that come my way, they're not bankable. I cannot justify these projects to my board, to my shareholders, to my beneficiaries. So we need to really, you know, as the international community, as UN agencies, look at supply of finance, demand of finance, and demand has a lot to do with the economics on the ground. You know, how can we make sure that you know, leaving a forest standing will be economically, even in the short term. In the long term, we know it is. Even in the short term, equally profitable than replacing it with soy or palm oil. What are the mechanics that we have? And of course, you know, carbon markets can play a role in that and other such things. But again, supply and demand, and we need to get both right. And final point, we really need to distinguish as we engage the private sector between parts of the private sector that are the innovators, that develop the new solutions, typically startups, typically universities, and they need very specific kinds of support, versus parts of the private sector that then adopt the solutions, deploy them at scale, and replace them with whatever technologies and infrastructures are creating the problems in the first place. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Great, thank you so much, Remco. There's so much in there. It is fascinating to hear that, right? So there are good scenarios right now in terms of looking at this for climate change, and that, you know, there needs to be more of this for biodiversity. There is a lot of work on scenario development. Yes. Certainly, you mentioned that the Science-Based Targets Network has started work on that, but there's more coming. I won't deny that it's more complicated for the nature space indeed, but that's one thing that's important. Yeah, the question of private versus public finance, both the supply and demand question as well. But also, I also liked your notion that you mentioned near the end about the nuances. Let's be really clear about what the public finance can go to and what private, and let's not expect, you know, private sector finance to go in areas where it shouldn't be going as well. So that's really, really important too. Solutions, right? So these are commercial opportunities, but I guess if there anybody here who's run any of their businesses or worked in the sector, you know that there is indeed, as you pointed out, a gap between there's innovation, but then there's adoption that you've got to look at. So you've got innovation, but then what happens for the adoption, that's another part. And then, yeah, better projects. If we're going to engage with the private sector, let's make sure that we work on the way we develop projects. But I think that's an opportunity for a dialogue with the financial sector, with the private sector as well, where we can learn what is required for that better project work as well. So great. So thanks very, very, very much, Remco. Wonderful, wonderful things. I'm glad we captured that. So now we're going to turn to a pretty challenging task. So it's a good thing we've got Susan Gardner with us, who's the Director of Ecosystems at UNEP. She's the discussant for all of this. So I'm going to ask her a question, but I'm going to assume that she's been listening to everything. And I see she got detailed notes, so she can put this together. So Susan, we've heard, and you've been taking note of the perspectives we've heard here today on ambition and urgency, not just in the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, as well as for climate change. So given the discussions we're having here at COP28 and what we're hearing around the global stocktake, and we need to ramp up action, what is the way forward for us to really coalesce the implementation on these joint crises and put us on track to this mission here for the framework of living in harmony with nature? An easy task for you. Go.
Super easy, yeah. Well, first I would just congratulate you and David and all of the team at CBD for the extraordinarily robust discussion and filling the room on this topic. That's fantastic to see that conversation at a climate COP on biodiversity fills the room. So start right there with a big win. And I would just, you know, I'm thinking through all the comments that have been made and trying to figure out what I think needs to be truly reiterated, because it has been such a robust conversation. And, you know, I'd start by saying, of course, we're hearing climate change is an existential threat to all species survival on the planet, including humans and all biodiversity. And we know, and we have heard in this conversation reiterated that it's one of the 5 main drivers of biodiversity loss. So that's been clear in your discussion here today. And you have been very focused on solutions and how do we do this. And that's what we need to be really focused on now. Delivering on biodiversity commitments does deliver on climate commitments, and we've seen that through the Kunming-Montreal Biodiversity Framework. We just can't solve one crisis without the other. And if that's the message that everybody tweets today and takes home from here, that's what we know, and that's what we've heard from everyone. We've heard it's urgent, and we've heard it requires all of us. The whole society approach just means all of us. Not leaving anyone out of the conversation or the empowerment or the governance or being part of contributing their wisdom and their ideas. And, you know, this has changed a lot. You know, COP27 was one of the first times that nature-based solutions was formally acknowledged in a prominent cover decision. We're seeing in the global stocktake that the discussions, including from leaders just last week, are talking about natural ecosystems play a key role in adaptation, and that has to be included. So recognizing explicitly the importance of progress on implementation of the biodiversity framework is a great step forward in terms of bringing the climate and the biodiversity conversations together. Conservation of restoration of ecosystems of all kinds will contribute to adaptation, building resilience, and mitigating carbon. So there's a lot of conversations historically here about forests, which are critical, but you know, you look at peatlands and you realize that they're covering only 3 or 4% of the world's surface and have an enormous, inordinate amount of carbon in the soil. Mangroves, similarly. And so we can ensure that the conversation is broader than forests, and I think we're hearing that there's that recognition more and more now that these investments are very worthy and that they're essential and that they provide immediate benefits. Across the COP, we've had the conversations, and we'll be having a food day, discussions about agriculture, and we know that likewise the GBF calls for better managed of productive lands and agriculture. And given the role of the ag sector that plays in carbon emissions, it just simply makes sense that our climate-smart agricultural progress is nature positive at the same time. Similarly, in cities, big conversations about how essential it is that this starts with urban planning and better management of urban green spaces. And I had the honor of being on a panel with the mayor from Barranquilla just earlier this week. And they were understanding that not only is this good for recreation of their citizens, this is essential for all of those other benefits to reduce the heat waves and the flooding and to create more of a resilience to the extreme weather events that are threatening millions around the globe and is only going to get worse. And of course, the very important points that have been made by this panel on finance and what we heard from Kai about changing economies by having the right incentives that actually create the positive, nature positive shifts in markets and businesses is essential to enable that environment. So meeting the commitments to conserve intact ecosystems, coupled with these commitments on the biodiversity framework for improved management, will deliver climate commitments. So we need to work together, and the UN has a central role in this, clearly. We need to help across the UN agencies strengthen these connections, and our brother and sister agencies have gotten that message as well. The Secretary General has made sure that we have a recent MOU between UNEP and WFP where we are incorporating resilience building through ecosystem-based adaptation into WFP's work in local communities because they realize they can't meet their future mandate without it. And this needs to be part of how they deliver their humanitarian assistance. And UNEP has been very pleased to be working with the CBD and UNDP on supporting countries, almost 170 countries, to review and update their MBSAPs. again, taking that whole of society approach, ensuring that we are linking the NBSAPs to the similar processes with the NDCs, including that ambition, including that connection with monitoring frameworks, ensuring accountability, putting focus, for example, on policy harmonization, on financial planning, on ensuring that the voices of indigenous peoples, women, and youth are included in these conversations. So I would just say, in conclusion, I mean, more and more every day we're seeing these connections, and that's fantastic. That's a very important message from this discussion. The crises of climate and biodiversity are disastrous, and they're human-made disasters, and so there are human solutions for this, which means we have to invest more in building capacity of the institutions. We need to do this particularly in the Global South. We need to be able to deliver on and understand national priorities for linking climate and biodiversity. And we're out of time. We're out of time for duplicative actions. We're out of time for inefficiencies, and we're out of time for the silos. We need to focus on the actions that have the biggest impact, and that's going to be working together, and working together across biodiversity and climate for the sectors that benefit both. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Susan, for tackling all of the matters in the panel here. So we've had such an incredibly rich discussion and presentations. We're down to about 5 minutes left. So I think we're going to try to take a question and see what time we have left. I'm going to look around the audience. I know it makes it a little bit challenging for everybody. Okay, we'll have a question right in the front row. So introduce yourself, make your question very short, and which panel members do you want to speak?
Promise is going to be short, thank you. My name is Maya Kent from Anwar Gargar's Diplomatic Academy. My question is for, I think, whoever feels comfortable replying. What would you like to see in final texts and decisions related to biodiversity, and kind of how, what would you like to see, what kind of connection would you like to see transpire in COP28?
Okay, good, great, thanks. We'll take one more question in the row behind you there. Again, introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Annabelle Kennedy, working with Women Engaged for a Common Future. A question and a comment, because I heard some speakers talking about the importance of hearing whose voices are not being heard, whose voices are not in the room. And we've also just heard about, you know, the importance of indigenous voices and women's voices. But actually, when I hear some of the terminologies and the concepts being used, nature-based solutions, commodification of nature, these, well, a lot of the constituencies at the UNFCCC are calling false solutions, it makes me think that these voices are not being heard, because these are not the things that the constituencies, such as the women and gender constituency, the indigenous peoples organizations, are calling for. So it's really a question of how are we still talking about this and talking about the importance of hearing those voices when that doesn't seem to be the case. And a question, I guess, is in terms of the financing is, we know that the climate financing, a tiny proportion of that reaches the grassroots local level, an even tinier percentage of that reaches woman-led and gender-just approaches. So yeah, perhaps a question to those of how do we ensure that we learn those lessons also for biodiversity financing. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. So I think what we'll do is we'll start, David Cooper will tackle your question. In fact, this is something we've heard in other panels. So David, why don't you take the last question here? It's about, you know, gender language and the question of getting financing where it needs to go. So you start with that and then we'll get the next one after that.
Okay, so I'll try. I mean, I think this question about language is really important. There were a lot of discussions actually as the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework was negotiated. Embedded in that framework is recognition, actually, of the importance of different worldviews, including the concept of Mother Earth and the views of indigenous peoples, local communities, the different cosmovisions, if you like, of that. The IPBES assessment on diverse values contributed a lot, I think, to increasing the understanding of those issues. And in fact, you know, one of the targets, the target about sustainable consumption, talks about trying to essentially promote more equity so that we can be all living well in harmony with Mother Earth. So I think there is at least a move towards recognizing these different forms of the language. And if I can just sort of briefly comment on the other question too, I mean, definitely we would, as I mentioned earlier, like to see broader recognition of the importance of biodiversity in ensuring not only in carbon mitigation, but ensuring the resilience of those systems, thereby contributing to adaptation, which is really important. Developing countries are emphasizing the importance of adaptation alongside mitigation, but also that we have to look beyond carbon, right? And then, of course, we would like to see that the call for enhanced NDCs recognizes the opportunity to invest more in biodiversity, invest more in ecosystems to achieve those. And key to that will be many of the other things you raised about indigenous peoples, local communities, their role and so on. But we're running out of time. Thanks.
Great, thanks very much, David. Chiz, go ahead with 30 seconds.
Yeah, thanks. In terms of the final text, I assume you mean what comes out of here, right? Okay, so obviously global stocktake, Susan talked about it. It has been a very, very robust, inclusive process. At the end of the day, what's going to come out of that text and how it's going to actually highlight issues related to nature, the nexus, multiple benefits, as well as engagement of additional stakeholders is very important. If I may quickly respond, and also I would also look at the guidance coming to the GEF and GCF, because usually there's a lot of elements related to integration, particularly to the GEF. Whose voices are not heard and around the table? Very good point. I just want to let you know, for the governance arrangements for the GBF fund, the Global Biodiversity Framework Fund that we just established, we have agreed that we're going to have the youth, the conservation organizations, private sector, women, IPLCs, I'm forgetting one more stakeholder, they will have permanent observer seats, one from the north, one from the south. So there are movements that are being made to ensure they have the seats around the table to be heard. And we do have certain evolutions in the programming to enable support that could go to the IPLCs, and I can talk more about that bilaterally. Thanks.
Great, thank you very much. So thanks to all of you who've taken your time to join us. Let's continue the discussion. There's still panel members, and we can mill outside and continue this. Thanks so much, everybody, and thanks to our panelists as well.